Joe, he cut my head off. Did you see that? He cut my head off.
What a wuss.
Now playing on PlayStation.
Out of all the original PlayStation 1 RPGs, The Legend of Dragoon certainly leaves one of the more interesting legacies and seems to resonate with more fans these days than most of its other peers from back in the day. You really can't read a discussion or watch a video about PS1 RPGs without at least someone mentioning Legend of Dragoon, and usually to a resounding degree. Even in our own videos, if we ever mention that era of RPGs or make a video where Legend of Dragoon could be potentially relevant in any way, make no mistake, someone will be there in the comment section to let us know. Now, while The Legend of Dragoon is a very good game in my opinion, so are many other PS1 RPGs. So, why does this one seem to stick with more players over the years than most others? Well, in my opinion, there are various reasons for that. First of all, the marketing in this game was excellent, especially in the West. Sony did a fantastic job in hyping this up to be the next insanely epic cinematic RPG. It basically aimed to be a Final Fantasy killer. I know that initially may not make much sense as both games are on the PlayStation, a Sony system. However, Final Fantasy is obviously a Squaresoft series, whereas The Legend of Dragoon was developed by Japan Studio, a first-party studio of Sony Interactive. I remember seeing ads for The Legend of Dragoon everywhere, from magazines to video game aisles in stores like Targets and Walmart. There would be posters, and you could even play a demo of it. Man, times were good. I miss those days. Anyway, the overall aesthetic was just really cool, and I think it really appealed to a lot of gamers from back in that generation. I mean, what's not to love about badass flying dragon people with swords and cool spells and all types of shit? Apparently not much, considering it roughly sold about 3 times as much in America as it did in Japan. Now, given the genre is a Japanese role-playing game, it is quite a mystery how this one ended up selling way more over here than it did in its origin country, but that just further proves the point of the lasting legacy the game seems to have over here in the West. Despite its obvious popularity and success, enough to even get a greatest hits release, to many people's disappointment, it never ended up getting an actual sequel. This is made even weirder by the fact that literally every moderately successful JRPG on the PlayStation was part of a series in some way. That's no exaggeration either. There's obviously Final Fantasy, but then there's also stuff like Breath of Fire, Suikoden, Wild Arms, Lunar, and even games that didn't have sequels or prequels on the PlayStation but other consoles like Grandia, Chrono Cross, Star Ocean, Legend of Legaia. Hell, even though Xenogears may not have a true sequel, it's still been spiritually carried on in some way through Xenosaga and Xenoblade. Now, there are some other decent JRPGs on the PlayStation that didn't get sequels, such as Thousand Arms and Vanguard Bandits, but those are more niche, cult classic type titles, whereas Legend of Dragoon was more widely known and considered a hit to more gamers all around. Even a lot of my friends who don't play JRPGs at all, whether currently or even back in the day really, still remember Legend of Dragoon in some way or even played it and have good memories of it. It sort of had that Final Fantasy VII appeal in that it was able to reach out to different demographics other than the ones that would normally play those types of games. So yeah, there was a strong fan desire for the sequel and it probably would have done really well, at least in the West. Apparently, it was in development at one point, but unfortunately, it never came into fruition. Other than a Japanese manga series and art at one point being rumored to being a playable character in PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, which never ended up happening either, the series has pretty much been effectively dead. I think the fact that we never actually got a sequel, despite the fans obviously clamoring for one, only adds to the game's legacy and the reputation that it has in the West, especially considering all other popular JRPGs from back in that generation got a sequel in some way, like I previously mentioned. In the year 2021, 21 years after the game's North American release, The Legend of Dragoon seems to have a stronger fan base than ever these days, at least amongst the JRPG community. Because of that, I've been a little nervous to go back and review this game. Like many of you, I'm sure, this is a game that I remember playing a lot as a kid. However, I never got around to actually beating it. Usually, I wouldn't make it past disc 2 or 3 before my child brain would get bored and move on to something else, before ultimately starting the game over 2 years later and repeating the cycle all over again. So yeah, I remember the first disc like the back of my hand. The rest of the game, not so much though. A lot of it is going to feel like I'm playing it for the first time, and eventually I will get to a point where I am playing it for the first time. Now, with all that said, let's see how this PlayStation classic holds up all these years later in our retrospective over The Legend of Dragoon. The Legend of Dragoon begins with a really cool, highly detailed CGI cutscene that shows soldiers of sorts marching through a burning town, where they then proceed to approach a young girl and perform some type of weird demonstration on her. I'm always a fan of FMV openings to begin games, so right off the bat we're off to a pretty engaging start. Given the situation, one might expect some more intense music to reflect what's going on, but instead we're treated to a more chill and pretty relaxing track. It's a nice introduction to the more laid-back and soothing style of the game's music, I think. Shortly after this, we meet our main man Dart, this game's version of the spiky, blonde-haired, sword-wielding hero archetype. It turns out that it was actually Dart's hometown of Seals that got burned down, along with his childhood friend Shauna that got abducted by those soldiers. He finds out that she's being held captive in Helena prison nearby, so to no one's surprise, he rushes in headfirst to rescue her. Making his way through the prison, he meets up with a soldier from the opposing army by the name of Lavitz, where they then go on to form one of the biggest bromances I've ever seen in an RPG. All the bro-like dialogue, or vocabulary I should say, is pretty fun to read, I'm not gonna lie, but honestly, it does sort of feel like the game forces it a bit, as there's no real developments or significant events that should reinforce the idea that they're super close already. I mean, yeah, I know they just escaped from prison together, but really early on, the game wants you to believe that they're just the best of friends and have this super deep connection that really only people who have been friends for a long ass time would probably have. Don't get me wrong, I do enjoy the dynamic, as I'm all about bros being bros and doing bro things, but I just wish that it made a little more sense within the plot. Anyway, eventually Dart and Lavitz find a way to rescue Shauna and make their way out of Helena prison, where they then, through a turn of events, get wrapped up in the middle of the Serdian War. This is just the major conflict for Disc 1, however, the game gets much bigger and much more epic than that. On top of acquiring the abilities to turn into dragoons, there's stuff about the Black Monster, who is responsible for killing Dart's parents when he was a kid, the Dragon campaign, fought between humans and Winglies thousands of years ago, with the Winglies themselves being basically like flying humans with magical powers, stuff about the Moon Child, the moon that never sets, and other types of celestial shit. And of course, not to mention all the connections between these things. The lore in The Legend of Dragoon really is super interesting and easily one of my favorite things about it. All of the diverse locations, along with the very strong visual aesthetic, really do a lot and help fleshing out the world. The pre-rendered backgrounds, the use of colors, and the environmental effects are all absolutely top-notch and some of the very best on the entire PlayStation. This is an aspect that I think it outperforms even Final Fantasy VII in, and is on par with the backgrounds of that of Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy IX. Like, the ripple effects in the waves still look gorgeous to this day, let alone for the time. With some of the environments, I was just taken back by the sheer beauty of it. Like, damn, this game came out all the way back in 2000? To this day, some water effects still don't look that good in some games. The lighting effect and its reflection really adds a lot here, I think. This top-tier presentation extends out to every aspect of the game, really. Not only are all the towns unique and varied with vibrance and lush colors, but so are the dungeons. In my opinion, a lot of PS1 RPGs fall victim to bland and boring dungeon design, both visually and how they play out gameplay-wise. Like, even though I think the first two Suikoden games are amazing and do some things better than The Legend of Dragoon, dungeons are definitely not one of them, as they're basically just boring corridors. I have to give this game some credit for incorporating a lot of different mechanics in a lot of the dungeons, plus also making them really aesthetically pleasing to look at as well. While the graphics are already excellent on their own, all the abundance of CGI cutscenes and FMV sequences only further help bring the world of Indiness to life. These are incredibly impressive, especially for the time, and are just enjoyable to watch. Some of the scenes with dragons in particular really stick out to me with how epic they are. Overall, I just feel that they really nail the art direction here. When you take the vivid colors of the beautiful pre-rendered landscapes and combine it with the calming, serene music, it creates this really wondrous ambient atmosphere. It's a special type of vibe that you don't get in many others. It's one of my favorite parts about the game, really. I'm all about a great atmosphere, and The Legend of Dragoon is easily one of the best on the PlayStation when it comes to that, RPG or not. Visuals aside though, the music by itself is still pretty fucking awesome. While I remembered some tracks, before replaying this, I had honestly forgotten how dope it really was. The towns and some of the dungeon themes are real relaxing, the battle music is pretty catchy, the menu theme's a vibe, the emotional pieces hit ever so elegantly. I mean shit, there's even 4 overworld map themes, one for each of the 4 discs, and they're all cool in their own unique way. Other RPGs from this time period usually had 2 or 3 world map themes, but 4's pretty up there. I wouldn't say that The Legend of Dragoon is underrated at all these days, but I don't know, the soundtrack might be a little bit actually. When reading discussions on the game, I often usually just see stuff about the combat, the graphics, how epic the story is, and stuff like that. There's some comments on the music for sure, but not as much in comparison I feel. I really do think it's one of the better JRPG soundtracks on the entire PlayStation. Speaking of the combat though, let's take some time to dive into that. For the most part, The Legend of Dragoon plays out like a pretty standard, traditional, turn-based JRPG, just with some minor deviations. The biggest of such being the addition system, which also happens to be the biggest love-hate aspect about the game these days. When attacking an enemy, instead of just doing a regular attack, each character is equipped to what the game calls an addition that forces the player to accurately time out button presses to finish combos, aka additions, to maximize damage. There are a plethora of additions every character gains access to throughout the game, each with their own differing amounts of button presses and cadences between each hit. However, you can only equip one at a time in battle. Additions can level up and get stronger the more you successfully complete them, giving you a lot of incentive to try to do so. Some of the late game additions are pretty damn powerful, but they're also pretty complex to pull off as well, and if you don't successfully pull them off, you're gonna do shit damage. There's definitely a risk-reward element at play here, as you can opt for a more simple addition, giving you a surefire way to do some pretty good damage, or you can take the risk on a stronger, more complex addition and just pray that you can get it off. With that said, when you do pull off some of those harder additions with more timing involved, it's a greatly satisfying feeling. It's also just a good way to keep you engaged in combat, which JRPGs can tend to have a little bit of problem with sometimes. Now, you might be asking yourself, this addition system seems pretty cool. Why is it such a love and hate thing then? Well, there are some reasons for that. For some people, the additions are just too hard. If you're not good at these types of things, the battles, and especially the bosses, are going to be a really tough time for you. What makes them even more difficult is there's really no set rhythm between each of the additions either. Like, some of the additions are faster and slower than each other, yeah, but even in those individual additions, the hits range in cadence all over the place, with there maybe being like a couple fast back-to-back ones, then a slow one, followed by another fast one, and stuff like that. Besides the visual hitboxes, there's nothing really to go off of either, and even then, sometimes those can get blended in a bit with the background and the enemies. For me personally, outside of a few exceptions, I found these pretty manageable for the most part. Fuck Madness Hero though. That one always caused a lot of problems for me for some reason. The fact that it does shit damage and it's more about building up your SP made it even more annoying that I was stuck on this piece of shit for so long. I swear I would feel like I would finally get the hang of it, then I wouldn't play the game for 1 to 2 days, then start back at square one when I picked the game up and would fail it 20 times in a row. Ironically, Dart's next edition, Moonstrike, was actually really easy for me, even though I read a lot of stuff online with people having a hard time with it. Funny how that works. I also had a lot of problems with some of Lavitt's and Albert's editions, but besides those, most of the other characters were pretty easy for me. Another thing is that while the editions are engaging, they also draw out the battles and therefore the game as well. The battles are already pretty slow by nature, and no part help to it slowly panning around the backgrounds when battles start, but also regular attacks can take around 5 to 15 seconds because of the addition system. Whereas compared to, let's say, Suikoden again, regular attacks take like a second maybe, and they even happen simultaneously between your characters, so battles are over in a breeze, at least random battles. They're over in about 30 seconds or less, whereas random battles in Legend of Dragoon could last anywhere from around 1 to 5 minutes or so, with 5 minutes being more of an extreme scenario. In a genre where random battles happen all the time, you can see where this might be a problem. The slow-moving nature of the battle system really pads out the game's length for the wrong reasons. Thankfully, I think the developers were at least somewhat aware of this, as there's literally like no grinding in this game, which is nice. By just normally playing the game, you're always appropriately leveled for boss battles, which you best be prepared for with some strong additions, as some of these, especially late in the game, can last a long time, like 30 minutes or so in some cases. Get the snacks out, you're gonna be here for a while. Additions aside, the other biggest gameplay feature the Legend of Dragoon has is of course the Dragoon system. This is a cool idea in theory, but not executed that well in my opinion. In order to turn into a Dragoon, you have to build up your SP meter, which you get by successfully completing additions. Once in Dragoon form, you can attack in a Dragoon version of an addition, or with magic which is unique to the form. The Dragoon additions are honestly kinda hard to pull off, at least to a perfect degree. I only did so a handful of times in my entire playthrough. Magic is quite strong though, and can range in effects from attacking, healing, and shielding the party. You do run out of MP quick however, so you gotta use it wisely, and it's probably best saved for boss battles. The amount of time you can stay in Dragoon form depends on your Dragoon level. So, if your Dragoon level is 3, you can stay in Dragoon form for 3 turns. Now, the reasons why I think this system could have been implemented better: for one, you can't use items in Dragoon form, meaning you don't have a way to heal yourself unless your Dragoon has specific healing magic, which not a lot of them do. Second, late game editions are pretty much just as strong, if not stronger, than the Dragoon editions themselves. And the third reason, the Dragoon transformation, along with all the animations that go with the attacks and the magic, are just so slow and take so long. I mean, yeah, they're cool to watch the first time, but after the 20th time, you're just like, I don't really want to watch a 45-second animation every time I want to use some magic. So yeah. Cool idea and gimmick, but also not something that I really liked using all the time. Aside from the addition and the Dragoon system, the Legend of Dragoon also has a really interesting defend mechanic that restores some of your HP when you use it, and also blocks against any potential status effects from enemies in that turn. Because of the healing mechanic associated with it, you will be using this a lot strategically, which is a pretty cool touch, as the defend option in most RPGs just get left to the wayside and are never really used, as they're a waste of a turn. Given the limited inventory number and therefore limited healing options, it really comes in handy and is quite useful. And on that note, I should also address the inventory system itself. The Legend of Dragoon may be like Final Fantasy in many ways, but inventory management is definitely not one of them. You can't just stack up 99 elixirs, high potions, and phoenix downs like it was nobody's business. Oh no. In this game, you're only allowed 32 items total. Total meaning the items don't stack either. Equipment doesn't count, but all usable items like healing stuff and revives, attack magic, antidotes and whatnot, all count. Attack magic items are also really strong in this game, so you're probably going to want some of those in there and not just fill up your entire inventory with healing stuff only. Because the inventory is so limited, you're going to be walking around maxed out most of the time, which makes it pretty annoying to come across chests, as you're either going to have to discard or use something in order to make room. I do like the strategy that this calls for, but I don't know, 32 is just a little bit not enough. I get why they put the small number in place to prevent you from getting overpowered with tons of attack magic, but 40 or 50 may have been a little more appropriate, I think. Not even for the difficulty, as the game's not super hard or anything, but just purely for the annoyance factor every time you come across chests and have to manage your inventory. On the topic of petty grievances, let's keep this trend going. The world map is a letdown. Instead of the free-roaming, overworld style like the Final Fantasy games and many other JRPGs from that time period, The Legend of Dragoon just gives us linear pathways between each location with no way to branch out to other places. I always loved frolicking around on huge, sprawling, overworld maps and shit while discovering secrets, so this kinda sucked, not gonna lie. Random battles can also still occur here, making it even worse. Though I will say the arrow above Dart's head on dungeon screens, with the color changing based on how close you are to triggering a random battle, is a nice touch. While I do really like the story in this game, the writing itself and the dialogue between characters is just so stiff. It just reads so robotically, I feel like. There's just not a lot of life and flavor to it. Like, even the moments that are supposed to be lighthearted and fun don't even really come off that way just because the dialogue is written so unnaturally. I mean, JRPG translations were never really the best back in the day, but just compare the way dialogue flows in conversation in this game compared to other games like Xenogears, Final Fantasy IX, Suikoden, and stuff like that. It's night and day. It sucks because I really feel like a lot of ideas behind scenes were really good. I just wish they were executed better with the writing to make it feel more realistic or believable in the moment. It makes me wonder how the writing is in the original Japanese version. If anyone's played that version and actually understands Japanese well, let us know in the comments below how it is. I think the cast in Legend of Dragoon is already really memorable on their own due to their design and definable personality traits, but with better writing, they really could have been taken to the next level, I think, and could have become more iconic than they already are. Despite that, I still love the characters. Now their voices, on the other hand, not so much. They're definitely charming in a super cheesy, bad 90s video game voice acting type of way, but some important story events told through CGI cutscenes are kind of ruined because of it.
Oh, it cannot be!
Oh, but they are, Rose. They are. Thankfully, while the characters may not display the best emotion through their actual voices or through the writing, they are able to do so through the expressive animations. Each character has their own distinct style of movement that lets you know their personality just by how they move and stand around. You know Miryu's the bubbly, energetic one just by how she's always bouncing around and flailing her arms about. You can tell Rose is the brooding loner by how she always stands off to the side with her arms folded. Haschel's got that Master Roshi old martial artist swag, the way he walks with a hunch and with his hands behind his back. And yeah, you get the idea. I just think the animations and movement styles do a lot in helping bringing the characters to life, and therefore making them more memorable. And honestly, that's a good way to sum up this game in one word: memorable. No matter how you slice or dice it, it's pretty obvious that the game seems to have a lasting impression on many players, myself included. While I don't necessarily think every single aspect of the game holds up particularly well these days, I still think it's a great experience overall, one of the best RPGs on the PlayStation, and a certified classic within the genre. With some quality of life improvements, a faster paced battle system, and some better writing, I do honestly think this game could have stood toe-to-toe with some of the best Final Fantasy games. In its current state, however, ultimately, I do think it falls a bit short in being the Final Fantasy killer that it aimed to be. There are some aspects I like about it over Final Fantasy 7 and 8, but I think FF9 is a superior experience in pretty much every way. Because those games also have recent ports with quality of life improvements, I'm much more likely to go back and play those these days compared to Legend of Dragoon. It just moves a little too slow to replay consistently, I think. Pelvic Gaming summed up my thoughts pretty well in her review on this game. I think it's a really great game, but at the same time, I just don't really have a desire to go back and replay it anytime soon. It starts to wear a little bit by the end, not gonna lie. If there was a sequel, it really could have improved some of these aspects and could have had the potential to be like a 10 out of 10 game. The lore and a lot of stuff about this world is just really interesting. There's so much potential there. Maybe one of these days they'll revive this lost series and finally realize all the untapped potential. Until then though, at least we have this special, one-of-a-kind experience to look back upon fondly. Thank you, Legend of Dragoon. While you may not have gotten the fate you deserved, what you are deserving of is a legacy you have to this day among gamers and RPG fans everywhere. Alright, and that wraps up this retrospective over The Legend of Dragoon. Man, what a classic. I'm really glad that I finally got around to beating it after all these years. For a game I have such great memories with, it was long overdue. I even remember back in the day, there was this one time during elementary school where we had to bring a book to class to read for whatever reason, and my ass fucking brought the Legend of Dragoon strategy guide, just to paint you a little picture of how into the game I really was. What are some of your guys' favorite memories with the game though? And what was the hardest edition for you? Let us know with a comment below. And if you enjoyed the video, it would mean a lot if you could hit that like button. It really does a lot in helping our channel grow. Plus, this has been our longest video so far and took a little more time than the others. As always, huge thank you to our Patreon supporters for helping support the channel. Your generosity is much appreciated. Regardless, we're happy just to have you here watching though. Other than that, have an awesome day everyone. This is Gaming Productions. Until next time.